In the early morning darkness of November 2007, in a town so small most maps forgot to mark it, a 9-year-old girl vanished from her own bedroom. Within days, 2 men would confess to her murder. Her stepfather and his best friend would both claim responsibility for taking her life. But forensic science would prove that only one of them could have done it. One confession was true, one was false. The question that would haunt investigators, prosecutors, and a heartbroken community for 17 years was simple and terrible. Why would an innocent man confess to murdering a child? This is the story of Rowan Damia Ford, a little girl who loved the color purple, who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, who arrived at school hours early because home felt dangerous. This is the story of systemic failures, of adults who looked away, of warning signs ignored until it was too late. This is a story about 2 confessions, forensic contradictions, and the agonizing 17-year journey from crime scene to execution chamber. This is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about confessions, guilt, and the systems designed to protect our most vulnerable. The case of Rowan Ford stands as one of Missouri's most troubling criminal investigations, not just because of the brutality of the crime itself, but because of the cascade of failures that preceded it. It's a case that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how we protect children, how we investigate crimes, and how the justice system grapples with evidence that contradicts human confession. In the 17 years between Rowan's murder and the execution of her killer, this case would generate thousands of pages of legal documents, dozens of appeals, petitions signed by thousands of people, and a moral debate that divided communities across the state. It would force jurors to reconsider their own decisions, prosecutors to defend their strategies, and defense attorneys to argue that even the guilty deserve mercy. But at the center of all of it, the legal proceedings, the forensic debates, the philosophical arguments about justice and vengeance, was a 9-year-old girl who never got to grow up. Her name was Rowan Damia Ford, and this is her story. Stella, Missouri sits in the southwestern corner of the state, nestled in the Ozark foothills where the landscape rolls and dips in gentle waves of forest and farmland. It's the kind of place that exists in America's collective imagination, a rural community where life moves slowly, where generations of families have worked the same land, where everyone knows everyone in their business too. With a population hovering just under 200 souls, Stella is barely a town at all. There's no main street lined with shops, no traffic lights, no police department of its own. It's a collection of houses scattered along country roads, separated by fields of corn and soybeans, connected by gravel driveways that turn to mud when it rains. The nearest city of any size is Joplin, about 45 minutes away. The nearest Walmart is in Neosho, half an hour's drive. For people who live in Stella, going to town means a significant trip, planned around work schedules and gas money. It's a place where poverty often hides in plain sight. Houses that look fine from the road might have broken furnaces in winter, might rely on space heaters that make electric bills unaffordable, might have roofs that leak and plumbing that doesn't work quite right. People help each other out when they can, but everyone's struggling with something. This was the world Rowan Ford was born into in January 1998. In November 2007, Rowan was 9 years old and in 4th grade at Triway Elementary School in nearby Washburn. The school served the rural communities scattered across the area. Children from families who worked in factories, on farms, in the service jobs that kept small towns limping along. Rowan had sandy blonde hair that fell past her shoulders when it was clean and brushed, which wasn't often. She had bright hazel eyes that seemed to see more than a 9-year-old should have to see. She was small for her age, thin in a way that spoke of irregular meals and constant worry, but she loved learning. Her teachers would later remember that about her, how much she loved school, how eager she was to be there, how she would arrive sometimes 2 or 3 hours before the first bell rang. At first, teachers assumed she was just an early riser, or that her mother had to drop her off on the way to work. But as the pattern continued, as they noticed other things about Rowan, they began to understand that she wasn't coming early because it was convenient. She was coming early because school was the safest place she knew. Rowan lived in a small, aging house with 3 adults, her mother, Colleen, her stepfather, David Spears, and a family friend named Christopher Collins who had been staying with them for several weeks, sleeping on their couch because he had nowhere else to go. The household was chaotic in the way that poverty makes households chaotic. Money was always tight. Bills went unpaid. Tempers flared over small things because everyone was stressed about big things. The adults drank, not every night, but often enough. Arguments happened. Doors slammed. And Rowan, quiet and observant, learned early how to make herself small, how to stay out of the way, how to become invisible when the energy in the house turned dark. But she couldn't make herself invisible at school. Her teachers at Triway Elementary noticed things that troubled them deeply. Rowan's hair was often matted and dirty, tangled in a way that suggested it hadn't been brushed or washed in days. In the cold Missouri winter, she would show up without socks, her small feet sliding around in shoes that were too big and too worn. Her coat was inadequate for the temperatures, a thin jacket when the thermometer dropped below freezing. Most troubling was the lice. Rowan had chronic, persistent head lice, not a one-time problem that could be solved with over-the-counter treatment, but an ongoing infestation that suggested profound neglect at home. Teachers would send her home with treatment kits and instructions. Sometimes the problem would improve briefly, but it always came back. The teachers knew what they were seeing. They had been trained to recognize signs of neglect. They understood that children who arrive at school hours early might be fleeing something at home. They knew that chronic lice, unwashed hair, inadequate winter clothing, and irregular meals weren't just poverty. They were indicators that a child's basic needs weren't being met. They documented everything. They made calls to the state child abuse and neglect hotline, calls that are supposed to trigger investigations, home visits, interventions. They filed reports with detailed observations about Rowan's appearance, her behavior, her obvious suffering, and each time, the system responded with surface-level interventions. A caseworker would visit the home. Things would look acceptable enough. Not great, but not catastrophic. The adults would promise to do better. Maybe they would send Rowan to school with clean hair for a few days. Maybe they would make sure she had socks. The lice would be treated temporarily. The case would be closed, and Rowan would continue living in that house. Nobody dug deeper. Nobody asked why a 9-year-old was so desperate to get to school that she arrived in the dark. Nobody pushed past the surface-level compliance to ask what was really happening behind closed doors. The child protection system, overwhelmed and underfunded, had looked at Rowan Ford's situation and decided it didn't rise to the level of immediate danger. The workers who made that decision weren't cruel or incompetent. They were triaging an impossible workload, making judgment calls with inadequate information, bound by legal standards that require clear evidence of imminent harm before children can be removed from their homes. But those workers weren't the ones who saw Rowan every day. They weren't the ones who watched her sit in the empty hallway at 6 a.m, waiting for school to start. They weren't the ones who saw her face light up when she was handed a book, or who heard her talk about wanting to be a veterinarian someday, to work with animals, to help creatures who couldn't help themselves. The teachers saw all of that, and they felt powerless. Rowan loved purple. The color showed up everywhere in her life. Purple was her favorite crayon. She would draw pictures of purple flowers, purple horses, purple skies. When she had a choice of what to wear, she chose purple. It was a bright spot in a life that was otherwise gray and frightening. She loved to read. Teachers would let her take books home, though they knew the books might come back damaged or not come back at all. Rowan would lose herself in stories, tales of children who went on adventures, who solved mysteries, who escaped from difficult situations and found happiness. She loved animals with the fierce devotion that lonely children often have. She would talk about the dogs and cats she saw around the neighborhood, about wildlife she spotted in the woods. She told her teachers that when she grew up, she was going to be a veterinarian. She was going to help animals. She was going to make sure they didn't suffer. In hindsight, it's heartbreaking how clearly Rowan was expressing her own need to be helped, to be rescued from suffering. But children don't always have the words to ask for what they need. They communicate through behavior, through the stories they tell, through the dreams they share. Rowan was screaming for help in every way a 9-year-old knows how. And still she continued living in that house in Stella, surrounded by adults who should have protected her, watched by a system that had already decided she wasn't in enough danger to warrant more serious action. She was running out of time. The calendar turned to November 2007. The days grew shorter and colder. Thanksgiving was approaching. Christmas decorations were starting to appear in stores. Rowan Ford had less than 2 weeks to live. Friday, November 2nd, 2007, began like any other school day for Rowan Ford. She woke up in the small house in Stella, got ready for school as best she could with whatever clean clothes were available, and made her way to Triway Elementary. The school day unfolded in its familiar rhythm. Rowan sat in her fourth-grade classroom, completed her assignments, participated in lessons. She was a good student when she could focus, when the chaos of home life didn't intrude too much into her ability to concentrate. When the final bell rang that afternoon, releasing students into the November chill for the weekend, Rowan gathered her things. As she walked toward the door, she turned and waved to her teacher. A small gesture, the kind of casual goodbye that happens 1,000 times in every school. That wave would be the last time most people saw her alive. Years later, that teacher would remember that wave with agonizing clarity, would remember Rowan's small hand raised, her slight smile, the way she looked so ordinary in that moment. Nothing about that goodbye suggested it was permanent. Nothing warned that Rowan Ford would never return to that classroom, would never complete another assignment, would never grow beyond 9 years old. But in the moment, it was just a wave goodbye. Another Friday, another weekend ahead. Saturday, November 3rd, unfolded quietly at the house in Stella. Rowan was home with her mother, her stepfather David Spears, and Christopher Collings, who continued to occupy the couch that had become his semi-permanent residence. Collings was 36 years old, originally from Arkansas, with a history of moving from place to place, staying with friends, never quite establishing a stable life. He had known David Spears for years. They ran in the same circles, drank together, shared the kind of transient friendship that develops between men whose lives haven't worked out the way they'd hoped. Collings had been staying at the house for several weeks. He helped out sometimes, doing odd jobs, contributing what money he could. The arrangement was informal, the kind of thing that happens in poor rural communities where people help each other survive. But having an adult male stranger living in a house with a 9-year-old girl should have raised concerns, should have triggered questions about whether that was an appropriate situation, should have prompted someone, a relative, a teacher, a caseworker, to ask whether Rowan felt safe with this man sleeping feet away from her bedroom. Nobody asked. Saturday passed in the slow, unremarkable way that rural weekends often do. There was television. There were small chores. There was the kind of bored waiting that happens when you're 9 years old and there's nothing to do and nowhere to go. Rowan's mother, Colleen, prepared for her overnight shift at the Walmart in Neosho. Colleen worked the night shift regularly, 10 at night to 6 in the morning, stocking shelves and working the registers when the store was mostly empty. It was how she kept food on the table, how she paid the bills that couldn't wait any longer. Leaving Rowan in the care of David Spears and Christopher Collings was routine. It had happened many times before without incident. There was no reason to think this night would be different. Colleen kissed her daughter goodbye, told her to be good, and left for work. She would never see Rowan alive again. After Colleen left, evening settled over the house. David Spears and Christopher Collings began drinking. Beer, then harder liquor, the kind of drinking that happens when you have nowhere to be and nothing to do, and you're trying to make the hours pass. The television played. The men talked and laughed and grew progressively more intoxicated. Rowan was in her room, likely trying to stay out of the way children learn to do when the adults are drinking. And then, at some point in the deepening darkness of that November night, David Spears left the house. He would later say he went driving. Just driving around, no particular destination, no particular reason. He couldn't explain where he went or what he did. He couldn't provide names of people he saw or places he stopped. He had no receipts, no witnesses, no way to verify any part of his story. What is known is that David Spears was gone from the house for approximately 5.5 hours. 5.5 hours during which Rowan Ford was left alone with Christopher Collings. 5.5 hours that would become one of the most debated aspects of the entire case. 5.5 hours that Spears could never adequately explain. The house in Stella sat quiet under the Missouri stars. Inside, a 9-year-old girl and a 36-year-old man. Outside, darkness and isolation and miles of empty countryside where no one would hear anything, no one would see anything, no one would intervene. What happened next would shatter multiple families, traumatize an entire community, and set in motion a 17-year legal process that would end in an execution chamber. The details of what happened that night come from Christopher Collins' own confession and from the forensic evidence that would later corroborate his account in horrifying detail. Sometime in the dark hours after midnight, after David Spears had left the house, after Rowan had gone to bed, Christopher Collins entered her room. Rowan was asleep. She was a child, small and vulnerable, trusting on some level that the adults in her home, even the ones she barely knew, would keep her safe. That's what children do. They trust because they have no other choice. Collins sexually assaulted her. The brutality of the attack was severe. Medical examiners would later document catastrophic internal injuries, the kind of trauma that speaks to extreme violence, to a complete disregard for the humanity and fragility of a small child. Rowan's body, not yet developed, not yet fully formed, suffered damage that no 9-year-old should ever endure. She was in agony. She may have cried out, though with the nearest neighbor far enough away that screams wouldn't carry, it wouldn't have mattered. She was terrified, in pain, unable to understand what was happening to her or why. And then, either to silence her cries or to eliminate the only witness to his crime, Christopher Collins strangled Rowan Ford to death. The medical examiner would later document ligature marks on her neck, deep impressions that indicated strangulation using some kind of cord or rope, applied with enough force to cut off her airway completely. Petechiae, tiny burst blood vessels, appeared in her eyes and on her face, classic signs of asphyxiation. Her small body bore the unmistakable signatures of a violent death. Rowan Ford died in her own bedroom, in the house where she should have been safe, killed by a man who had been welcomed into her home, while her stepfather was somewhere else doing something he could never explain. After killing her, Collins wrapped Rowan's body in her bedding, sheets and blankets that would later be forensically matched to fibers found at the disposal site. He carried her small form outside to his truck, a vehicle that neighbors had seen parked at the house for weeks without thinking anything of it. In the cold November darkness, Collins drove away from Stella with Rowan's body in his truck. He headed toward Wheaton, traveling along rural highways and back roads where traffic was non-existent at that hour. He knew where he was going, a place he had been before, a location remote enough that he believed no one would ever find what he was about to hide. The place was called Fox Cave, though it's not really a cave in the traditional sense. It's a sinkhole, a vertical shaft in the earth, the kind of geological formation common in the Ozark region where limestone bedrock is riddled with underground drainage systems. Over centuries, these underground chambers can collapse, creating sinkholes that drop straight down into darkness. Fox Cave was one of these sinkholes. Standing at its edge and looking down, you could see nothing but blackness, a void that seemed to swallow light itself. The shaft dropped approximately 40 to 50 feet straight down before opening into a larger chamber below. It was the perfect place to hide a body, remote, dangerous, rarely visited. Collins would have known that few people would ever venture close enough to look down into that darkness. He threw Rowan's body into the sinkhole. Her small form, wrapped in bedding, fell through the darkness and landed in the chamber below. She would remain there, hidden in the earth, while the world above searched desperately for any trace of where she had gone. Collins drove back to Stella. He arrived home before dawn, before David Spears returned from wherever he had been. He took Rowan's mattress, stained with evidence of his crimes, soaked with DNA and biological fluids that would definitively prove what he had done, and burned it. He burned the bedding that hadn't gone with Rowan's body. He tried to destroy every trace of his crime, every piece of physical evidence that could link him to her death. And then he waited. When David Spears returned home in the early morning hours, from wherever he had been, Doing whatever he had been doing for 5.5 hours, Rowan was already gone. The house was quiet. Collins was there, acting normally or as normally as a man can act after committing murder. Rowan's bedroom was empty, her mattress gone. No sign of the violence that had occurred just hours before. Spears would later claim he didn't notice anything was wrong, didn't notice the missing mattress, didn't check on Rowan, didn't find it strange that a 9-year-old girl wasn't around on Sunday morning. Neither man reported her missing. They sat in that house knowing Rowan was gone, saying nothing, doing nothing, as the hours ticked by. And when Colleen Ford came home from her overnight shift at Walmart on Sunday morning, expecting to find her daughter awake and watching cartoons, expecting to ask about her night and make breakfast and enjoy a quiet Sunday together, she instead walked into a nightmare that would never end. Her daughter was gone, and the two men who were supposed to have been watching her couldn't look her in the eye. Sunday, November 4th, 2007, dawned cold and gray over Stella, Missouri. Colleen Ford's shift at Walmart ended at 6 in the morning. She made the 30-minute drive home tired but looking forward to seeing her daughter, to having a quiet Sunday together. She walked into the house and immediately sensed something was wrong. The energy was off. The house felt wrong. David Spears and Christopher Collins were there, but Rowan wasn't. Where was Rowan? The answers she received were vague, contradictory, nonsensical. Maybe she went to a friend's house. Maybe she went for a walk. Maybe she just wandered off. But Colleen knew her daughter. Rowan was 9 years old. She didn't have friends she could walk to visit. Not in Stella, where houses were separated by half-mile stretches of country road and forest. Rowan didn't just wander off into the November cold without telling anyone. That wasn't who she was. Colleen began to panic. She demanded better answers. Where was her daughter? When did they last see her? What happened? The men's stories didn't make sense. They contradicted each other on basic facts. When had Rowan gone to bed? Was she in her room when they last checked? Who had seen her last? Hours passed. Terrible. Crawling hours where Colleen's panic grew into terror, and the two men in her house offered nothing but weak reassurances and implausible explanations. She wanted to call the police immediately. The men urged her to wait. Maybe Rowan would come back on her own. Maybe she was just hiding somewhere. Let's not overreact. But a mother knows when something is catastrophically wrong. Finally, at 6:50 in the evening on Sunday, more than 12 hours after Colleen had come home, more than 36 hours since anyone could definitively say they had seen Rowan alive, someone called 911 to report that a 9-year-old girl was missing from her home in Stella. The call went to the Newton County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher took down the information and immediately elevated the case to priority status. Missing children, especially young children, trigger immediate response protocols. Time matters desperately in these cases. The first hours are critical. Sheriff Chris Jennings responded to the call personally. At that time, Jennings was an experienced law enforcement officer who had worked in Newton County for years. He had seen plenty of missing person cases. He knew the statistics. Most missing children are found quickly. Most turn out to be misunderstandings. A child staying at a relative's house without telling their parents. A teenager running away after a fight. A mix-up about schedules or locations. But Jennings also knew that some cases are different. Some cases are the ones that keep police officers awake at night. When he arrived at the small house in Stella and began asking questions, every instinct he had honed over years of police work began screaming that this was not a routine missing person case. The adults' stories didn't match. Simple questions received complicated answers. David Spears and Christopher Collins contradicted each other on basic timeline issues. When they had last seen Rowan, what she had been wearing, who had been home when. Spears seemed evasive, answering questions with questions, volunteering very little information. Collins seemed nervous, his hands shaking slightly, his eyes not quite meeting Jennings' gaze. And then Jennings walked into Rowan's bedroom and noticed something that made his stomach drop. The mattress was missing. He stood in that small room looking at the bare bed frame and asked the question, "Where's the mattress?" The men said they had burned it. Why? Because it had lice. Because it was old. Because it needed to be replaced anyway. Sheriff Jennings had been in law enforcement long enough to know that burning a child's mattress the same night she disappeared was not normal behavior. It was not the action of innocent people dealing with a missing child. It was the behavior of someone trying to destroy evidence. He stepped back outside and immediately called for backup. This was not a missing person case anymore. This was a crime scene. Within hours, the case escalated dramatically. The FBI was notified. Federal agents with experience in child abduction cases, with resources and databases and forensic capabilities that small county sheriff's departments didn't have. Multiple county sheriff's departments mobilized. The Missouri State Highway Patrol became involved. Search and rescue teams prepared to deploy. Plans were made for a massive coordinated search effort. Press releases were drafted. Rowan's photograph, a school picture showing a small girl with light hair and serious eyes, was sent to media outlets across the region. But even as the official response geared up, even as volunteers began calling to offer help, even as neighboring counties prepared to send personnel and resources, Sheriff Jennings stood in that small house in Stella and felt the cold weight of certainty settling over him. This wasn't a runaway case. This wasn't a child who had wandered off and gotten lost. Something terrible had happened to Rowan Ford, and the two men who had been with her when she disappeared knew more than they were saying. The question was how to get them to tell the truth before it was too late, if it wasn't already too late. Jennings looked at the photograph of Rowan that would soon be distributed to the media. He studied her face, memorizing it. He put a copy of her school ID in his pocket, where it would remain for the next 17 years. Then he went back to work, racing against a clock that might have already run out. Monday, November 5th, 2007, brought one of the largest coordinated search efforts southwestern Missouri had ever seen. Word had spread rapidly through Newton County and surrounding areas. A 9-year-old girl was missing, possibly abducted. Time was critical. Volunteers poured in from communities across the region. Farmers and factory workers took time off from jobs they couldn't afford to miss. Church groups organized. Local businesses donated supplies, coffee, sandwiches, batteries for flashlights, bottled water. Women who had never met Rowan Ford showed up ready to search because she was someone's daughter, and that was enough. Professional search and rescue teams arrived with equipment and expertise. Cadaver dogs and their handlers came from multiple states. The Missouri State Water Patrol prepared to search ponds and creeks. Helicopter pilots volunteered to conduct aerial searches. The command center was established at a location where coordinators could organize the massive volunteer response, coordinate with law enforcement, and manage the flow of tips and potential leads that were already coming in. The terrain they had to search was vast and unforgiving. Newton County and surrounding Berry County encompass hundreds of square miles of Ozark wilderness, dense woods where visibility extends only a few feet, steep hills that exhaust even experienced hikers, abandoned mine shafts hidden beneath brush and leaves, sinkholes that appear suddenly in the forest floor, creeks swollen with November rain that twist through valleys. Every hollow could hide a body. Every abandoned building needed to be checked. Every dense thicket of brush could conceal evidence. Search teams were organized into grids, assigned specific areas, given maps and GPS coordinates. They walked in lines, arms length apart, eyes scanning the ground for any trace. Clothing, personal items, disturbed earth, anything that seemed out of place. They searched farmland and forest. They checked abandoned cars and empty barns. They waded through cold water and pushed through briars. They called Rowan's name until their voices went hoarse, hoping against hope that she was alive somewhere, lost but able to respond. As they searched, investigators were building a timeline and processing the crime scene at the house in Stella. The burned mattress was recovered from where it had been destroyed. Even burned, mattresses leave debris, metal springs, bits of fabric, residue. Forensic technicians collected everything, looking for any trace evidence that might have survived the fire. Cadaver dogs were brought to the house and property. These highly trained animals, capable of detecting the scent of human decomposition, even in minute quantities, were walked through the house and around the property. One of the dogs alerted on David Spears' Chevrolet Suburban. The alert meant the dog had detected the scent of human decomposition inside or on the vehicle. It was a significant development. The Suburban was immediately impounded and transported to a forensic processing facility where technicians would examine every inch of it, looking for blood, hair, fibers, DNA, anything that could prove Rowan had been in that vehicle. Strangely, when the cadaver dogs were exposed to Christopher Collins' truck, they did not alert. The animals showed no indication that they smelled decomposition in or on the vehicle. This seemed to support David Spears as the primary suspect. His vehicle had triggered an alert. Collins had not. The initial focus of the investigation began to center on Spears, but this would later prove to be one of the many contradictions that made the case so complex. Despite the cadaver dog alert, forensic processing of Spears' Suburban would find no evidence. No blood, no DNA, no fibers, nothing to indicate that Rowan's body had been inside that vehicle. Meanwhile, Collins' truck, which the dogs had cleared, had actually transported Rowan's body. It would eventually yield forensic evidence proving it. The dogs had been wrong. This wouldn't be understood until later, after confessions were made and the forensic science clarified what had really happened. But in those first desperate days of searching, investigators were working with incomplete information, following leads that sometimes pointed in the wrong direction, trying to solve a puzzle where pieces were missing and others didn't seem to fit. Tips began coming in from the public. People called to report suspicious vehicles they had seen on rural roads. Neighbors shared observations about the household. Teachers called to describe the signs of neglect they had reported. Each tip had to be followed up, investigated, either confirmed or ruled out. As the search entered its second day, hope was fading. Everyone involved knew the statistics. The longer a missing child remains missing, especially in November weather, the less likely it is they'll be found alive. Rowan had been gone for more than 48 hours now. The temperature at night was dropping into the 30s. If she was lost in the woods, injured or disoriented, she wouldn't survive much longer. And if she had been abducted, if someone had taken her intentionally, then the statistics were even grimmer. Sheriff Jennings continued to press David Spears and Christopher Collins. He brought them in for repeated interviews, asked the same questions different ways, looked for inconsistencies in their stories. Both men seemed to be hiding something. Both gave answers that didn't quite add up, but neither was confessing. Neither was providing the crucial piece of information that could lead searchers to Rowan. Across Newton County, volunteers continued to walk grid patterns through the wilderness, calling a little girl's name, hoping for a miracle that seemed less likely with each passing hour. Tuesday, November 6, 2007, 3 days after Rowan disappeared, investigators made the decision to intensify pressure on David Spears and Christopher Collins. The window for finding Rowan alive had effectively closed. Now the focus was on finding her body and bringing whoever was responsible to justice. The approach investigators took was strategic and based on relationships. Christopher Collins was to be interviewed by Clinton Clark, the chief of police in Wheaton. But Clark wasn't just another law enforcement officer to Collins. They were friends. They had known each other for 17 years. They had history, trust, a relationship that extended beyond professional boundaries. Clark used that relationship. He spoke to Collins not as a cop interrogating a suspect, but as a friend who was deeply concerned, who wanted to help, who needed to understand what had happened. The conversation lasted through the night. Clark didn't use aggressive tactics or threats. He appealed to Collins' conscience, to whatever humanity remained in him, to the friendship they had shared for nearly 2 decades. And somewhere in those long, dark hours, Christopher Collins broke. He confessed. He told Clark that he had entered Rowan's room while she was sleeping. He admitted to sexually assaulting her. He confessed to strangling her to death. He described wrapping her body in bedding, driving her to Fox Cave near Wheaton, and throwing her body into the sinkhole. He provided specific details: the route he drove, the location of the sinkhole, how far down the shaft went, what the bedding looked like. He drew a map showing how to find Fox Cave. He confessed to burning the mattress and bedding to destroy evidence. His confession was detailed, specific, and consistent. It was the confession of someone who had actually committed the crime, someone who knew details that only the perpetrator could know. At almost exactly the same time, in another location, David Spears was being interviewed by Newton County Coroner Mark Bridges. Bridges occupied a unique position in Spears' life. He was not only a county official with authority, but he was also Spears' employer and his pastor. Spears worked for Bridges' business. He attended Bridges' church. He looked up to Bridges as both a boss and a spiritual guide. Bridges applied his own form of pressure, the moral authority of a religious leader, the practical authority of an employer, the official authority of the coroner investigating a child's disappearance. Under that compound pressure, David Spears also confessed. But his confession told a different story. Spears claimed that he and Christopher Collings had killed Rowan together. He said they had both participated in the sexual assault. He said they had both been involved in disposing of her body. He said they had acted as a team, equally responsible, sharing the guilt. When investigators compared the two confessions, significant contradictions emerged immediately. Collings said he acted alone. Spears said they acted together. Collings provided specific details about locations and methods. Spears' details were vaguer, less certain. Collings' confession matched the timeline of events, the hours when Spears was gone from the house, leaving Rowan alone with Collings. Spears' confession didn't explain how both men could have committed the murder together when Spears admittedly wasn't even home. But investigators now had confessions from both men. They had a location where they believed Rowan's body could be found. They had enough to make arrests and enough to direct a recovery operation. Sheriff Jennings took Collings' map and directions and organized a team to go to Fox Cave. It was time to bring Rowan home. Using Christopher Collings' directions, investigators drove out to Fox Cave near Wheaton on November 6, 2007. The location was remote, accessible only by rough country roads, hidden in a landscape of hills and hollows that felt like the edge of the world. Fox Cave is a sinkhole, a vertical shaft dropping approximately 40 to 50 feet into darkness. Standing at its edge and looking down, investigators could see nothing but blackness. They called for specialized equipment and personnel trained in vertical rescue operations. A team prepared to rappel down into the cave. And there, wrapped in bedding exactly as Christopher Collings had described, they found Rowan Ford. Her body was recovered through a careful, painstaking operation. She was brought back up into the November daylight, into the presence of the investigators who had been searching for her, into the reality that this case was no longer a missing person investigation. It was a murder. Rowan's body was transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. The findings confirmed the worst details of Collings' confession. She had been strangled to death, ligature strangulation, with clear marks on her neck indicating the use of a cord or rope. Petechiae in her eyes and face confirmed asphyxiation. The autopsy documented severe internal injuries consistent with sexual assault, trauma so severe it could not have occurred without extreme violence. The medical examiner concluded that Rowan had suffered terribly before she died. Forensic analysis of the evidence told an even more detailed story. DNA testing found traces of Rowan in Christopher Collings' truck, specifically a partial hair profile that matched her. This placed her body in his vehicle, exactly as he had confessed. Additional biological evidence recovered from Rowan's body was subjected to DNA analysis. The results excluded David Spears as a possible contributor. In fact, further investigation revealed that Spears had undergone a vasectomy years earlier, making certain biological evidence found during the autopsy forensically impossible to have come from him. 3 independent forensic laboratories examined the evidence. All 3 reached the same conclusion. David Spears could not have been Rowan's rapist. The physical evidence did not support his confession. Christopher Collings, on the other hand, was forensically linked to the crime through DNA evidence, through the location of the body matching his directions, through every corroborating detail. One man confessed, and the evidence proved he was telling the truth. One man confessed, and the evidence proved he was lying. The question was no longer who killed Rowan Ford. The question was why David Spears had confessed to a crime he couldn't have committed, and what, if anything, he had actually done that night. As investigators compiled the evidence, the case against Christopher Collings became overwhelming. His confession, Rowan's body found where he said it would be, his DNA in his truck, the timeline matching his account. Everything pointed to his sole culpability. But the contradictions surrounding David Spears created a puzzle that frustrated everyone involved. The cadaver dogs had alerted on his Suburban. suggesting the scent of human decomposition. Yet forensic processing of that vehicle found no blood, no DNA, no fibers, no physical evidence that Rowan's body had ever been inside it. The dog's alert remained unexplained, a false positive perhaps, or contamination, or some other variable that produced a misleading result. Spears' confession included details that didn't match the crime scene. He described actions that weren't supported by evidence. He claimed participation that forensic science definitively ruled out. And then there was the question of his whereabouts during the critical hours when Rowan was murdered. Spears admitted to leaving the house for approximately 5.5 hours. He claimed he went driving, but couldn't provide specifics about where he went or why. No gas station receipts corroborated his story. No witnesses saw him. No surveillance footage captured his vehicle anywhere. For 5.5 hours, David Spears had no alibi, but also no evidence linking him to the murder. Computer activity logs from the house in Stella raised additional timeline questions. Analysis showed that someone had been using the home computer during portions of the night, activity that didn't align perfectly with either man's account. Investigators debated, was Spears an accomplice who helped plan the crime but didn't physically participate? Was he present during the murder but not involved in the assault? Did he help dispose of evidence? Did he simply know what Collings had done and fail to report it? Or was he completely innocent? An innocent man who gave a false confession under psychological pressure from an authority figure he trusted. The truth, as is often the case in complex criminal investigations, likely lay somewhere in a gray area that forensic science couldn't fully illuminate. What was clear was this: Christopher Collings had raped and murdered Rowan Ford. The evidence proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. What remained unclear was the full extent of David Spears' knowledge, involvement, or culpability. But the legal system would have to make decisions based on what could be proven in court, not on suspicions or unanswered questions. Christopher Collings was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and kidnapping. Due to concerns about pretrial publicity in Newton County, his trial was moved to Rolla, Missouri, in Phelps County, where a jury of 12 citizens would hear the evidence and decide his fate. The trial began in 2009. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the DNA, the autopsy findings, the location of the body. They played Collings' taped confession for the jury, letting them hear in his own words how he had assaulted and murdered a 9-year-old girl. The defense argued for life without parole instead of death, emphasizing Collings' difficult upbringing, his lack of prior violent crimes, his cooperation with investigators once he confessed. The jury deliberated for less than 1 hour. They found Christopher Collings guilty on all counts. In the penalty phase, they voted unanimously to recommend death. The judge accepted the recommendation. Christopher Collings was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the murder of Rowan Ford. But in America's legal system, death penalty cases automatically trigger extensive appeals. What followed was 17 years of legal proceedings, motions, hearings, appeals to state courts, appeals to federal courts, challenges based on jury instructions, challenges based on mental competency, challenges based on prosecutorial conduct. During those 17 years, Collings remained on death row at the Potosi Correctional Center in Missouri. And as the years passed, something unexpected happened. 3 of the jurors who had voted for his execution came forward to say they regretted their decision. They said that if they had known then what they knew now about the fallibility of the death penalty, about racial disparities in sentencing, about the possibility of rehabilitation, they would have voted for life without parole instead. Their statements became part of a clemency petition filed on Collings' behalf, asking the governor of Missouri to commute the death sentence to life in prison. The petition included affidavits from the jurors, letters from Rowan's family members who opposed the execution, statements from religious leaders and activists who argued that executing Collings wouldn't bring Rowan back or serve justice. The governor reviewed the petition. On November 26, 2024, just days before the scheduled execution, the governor denied clemency. On December 3, 2024, Christopher Collings was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. He was 53 years old. 17 years had passed since he murdered Rowan Ford. Some felt justice had been served. Others believed the execution was vengeance masquerading as justice, that a civilized society shouldn't kill people to show that killing people is wrong. What everyone agreed on was that no execution, no prison sentence, no legal proceeding could undo what had been done to a 9-year-old girl in November 2007. While Christopher Collins' case moved through the death penalty appeals process, David Spears' legal journey took a very different path. Initially charged with murder alongside Collins, Spears faced the possibility of decades in prison or even execution. But as forensic analysis conclusively eliminated him as Rowan's rapist and failed to place him at the crime scene, prosecutors faced a difficult decision. They couldn't prove murder. The physical evidence didn't support it. His confession contradicted the science. A jury might not convict based solely on a confession that was demonstrably false in key details. In 2012, 5 years after Rowan's murder, prosecutors dropped the murder charges against David Spears. Instead, he pleaded guilty to 2 lesser charges: child endangerment and hindering prosecution. The endangerment charge related to the documented neglect that Rowan had suffered while in his care, the conditions that teachers had reported, the poverty and chaos she had lived in. The hindering charge related to his actions after her death, including burning the mattress and not immediately reporting her missing. Spears was sentenced to 7 years in prison. He was released in 2015, having served his time with credit for good behavior and time already served while awaiting trial. And then, in a twist that outraged much of Missouri, David Spears was hired by the Missouri State Public Defender's Office as a mitigation specialist, someone who investigates defendants' backgrounds to present evidence that might reduce their sentences. The hire was controversial but legal. Spears had served his sentence. He had relevant life experience with the criminal justice system, and the Public Defender's Office, chronically underfunded and understaffed, needed workers. For years, Spears worked quietly in that role, staying out of the public eye. But in 2025, as Christopher Collins' execution date approached and media attention returned to the Rowan Ford case, the story of Spears' employment broke publicly. News outlets reported that the stepfather of a murdered child, a man who had confessed to her murder, even if the confession was later deemed false, was working for the state's public defender system. The backlash was immediate and intense. Victims' rights advocates were horrified. Rowan's family members expressed betrayal. The general public couldn't understand how someone connected to such a notorious crime could be employed in the justice system. Within weeks, under enormous public pressure, the Missouri Public Defender's Office terminated David Spears' employment. He disappeared from public view once again, a man who confessed to a murder he apparently didn't commit, who served time for endangerment and obstruction, who lost 5.5 hours that November night that he could never adequately explain. The question of why he confessed remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. Some believe he was psychologically coerced by Mark Bridges, the coroner who was also his employer and pastor, a figure of authority and spiritual guidance whose pressure might have overwhelmed Spears' resistance. Others believe Spears felt genuinely guilty, not for committing murder, but for leaving Rowan alone with Collins, for failing to protect her, for not calling the police immediately when he returned home and realized she was gone. Still others suspect that Spears knew more than he ever admitted, that his 5.5-hour absence wasn't as innocent as claimed, that perhaps he helped plan or conceal the crime even if he didn't physically participate. The truth died with Rowan and with Christopher Collins. What remains is a cautionary tale about the unreliability of confessions obtained under pressure, about how guilt and legal culpability aren't always the same thing, about how the criminal justice system struggles to deal with ambiguity. In the weeks and months after Rowan's body was found, the community of Stella and the surrounding areas grappled with grief, rage, and questions that had no satisfying answers. Rowan's mother, Colleen, was hospitalized for severe psychological trauma. She had lost her daughter in the most horrific way imaginable. She had trusted the men in her home to keep her child safe. She carried guilt, the guilt every parent feels when tragedy strikes, even when they weren't the ones who caused it. Rowan's older sister, who was a teenager when her little sister was murdered, would later speak publicly about the systemic failures that preceded Rowan's death. She talked about the poverty they grew up in, the adults who knew things were wrong but didn't intervene, the Child Protective Services reports that resulted in Band-Aid solutions instead of real help. At Triway Elementary School, Rowan's absence was overwhelming. Teachers who had tried to help her felt crushing guilt. Students who had known her struggled to understand why someone would hurt their classmate. The school planted a dogwood tree in Rowan's memory, a living tribute that would bloom every spring, marking the seasons that Rowan would never see. Purple balloon releases became an annual tradition, sending hundreds of lavender balloons into the Missouri sky on the anniversary of her death. When Rowan's class graduated from high school, when she would have been 18 years old, the ceremony included an empty chair in her honor. Her name was read. Her memory was preserved. The young woman she would have become was mourned alongside the 9-year-old child who was taken. Sheriff Chris Jennings, who had been one of the first responders to the missing person call, carried Rowan's school ID photograph in his pocket for 17 years. In interviews, he would take it out and look at it, a reminder of why he did the work he did, of the child he couldn't save, of the responsibility law enforcement has to the most vulnerable. The case led to some concrete changes in how child welfare concerns were handled in Newton County. Protocols were updated. Training was improved. Teachers received better guidance on recognizing and reporting signs of severe neglect and abuse. But those changes came too late for Rowan. Across Missouri and around the country, wherever the story of Rowan Ford was told, it sparked conversations about child protection failures. How many reports need to be filed before serious action is taken? Why are superficial interventions accepted when a child's safety is at stake? How do we balance family privacy with child welfare? What responsibility do teachers, neighbors, and community members have when they suspect abuse? These questions don't have easy answers. Child protective services are underfunded and overwhelmed in most states. Workers carry crushing caseloads. The legal threshold for removing a child from their home is intentionally high to prevent government overreach. And predicting which neglected child will become a victim of violence is impossible. But standing at Rowan's grave, looking at her name carved in stone, those complexities feel like excuses. A 9-year-old girl went to school with lice and no socks. She arrived hours early, as if school was the only safe place she knew. Adults documented her suffering and made calls and filed reports. And she was murdered in her own bedroom by a man who was sleeping on her family's couch. Somewhere in that chain of events, the system failed catastrophically. Even after Christopher Collins' execution, even after 17 years of investigations and trials and appeals, certain questions about the Rowan Ford case remain unanswered. Where was David Spears for 5.5 hours on the night Rowan was murdered? He claimed he went driving, but provided no specific route, no destinations, no explanation for why he left or where he went. No evidence corroborated his story. No evidence disproved it either. Those 5.5 hours remain a void in the timeline, a space where suspicion lives but proof doesn't. Why did cadaver dogs alert on Spears' Suburban if Rowan's body was never in that vehicle? Cadaver dogs are highly trained and generally reliable, but they're not infallible. False alerts can occur due to contamination, residual scents, environmental factors, or handler cue bias. But the alert raised questions that forensic science couldn't fully resolve. Was there some exposure to Rowan's body or belongings that left trace scent evidence? Or was it simply an unexplained anomaly? Why did David Spears confess to a murder that forensic evidence proved he didn't commit? This is perhaps the most debated question. False confessions happen more often than most people realize, particularly in cases involving psychological pressure, authority figures, sleep deprivation, or suspects who believe confession might lead to leniency. But what motivated Spears specifically? Guilt over failing to protect Rowan? Coercion by an authority figure he trusted? Fear that the truth about his whereabouts that night was somehow worse than a murder confession? We may never know. Was there involvement or knowledge that the forensic evidence simply couldn't capture? Did Spears help plan the crime without physically participating? Did he know what Collins was planning and do nothing to stop it? Did he help dispose of evidence or clean the crime scene? The absence of evidence isn't the same as evidence of absence. There may have been aspects of culpability that weren't charged because they couldn't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Could Rowan have been saved if Child Protective Services had acted more aggressively on the reports filed by her teachers? This is the question that haunts everyone who knew Rowan was suffering. Hindsight is perfect, but foresight is clouded by resource constraints, legal limitations, and the terrible reality that many neglected children never become victims of violence. Would removing Rowan from her home have saved her life? Almost certainly. But the legal and practical barriers to making that happen are substantial, perhaps too substantial in a system designed to balance child safety with family rights. These unanswered questions don't diminish the certainty of what is known. Christopher Collings raped and murdered Rowan Ford. Justice in the form of his conviction and execution was served according to the law. But justice and closure aren't the same thing. And for those who loved Rowan, who failed her, who tried to help her, the questions remain. Rowan Damia Ford is buried in Missouri, in a grave marked with purple accents, her favorite color. Visitors leave toys, flowers, and messages. Some are from family, some are from strangers who heard her story and wanted her to know she wasn't forgotten. She would have been 27 years old in 2025. She might have become the veterinarian she dreamed of being. She might have married, had children of her own, built a life that honored the resilience she showed even as a child trapped in terrible circumstances. Instead, she is forever 9 years old. Forever the little girl with matted hair who arrived at school early. Forever the child who loved purple and reading and animals. Forever the victim of a crime that shocked a nation. But she is also a symbol, a reminder of what happens when systems fail, when warning signs are ignored, when adults don't protect the children in their care. Rowan's case represents the danger of false confessions and the importance of forensic science in separating truth from psychological coercion. It represents the catastrophic consequences of underfunded and overwhelmed child protection systems. It represents the complexity of cases where evidence contradicts confessions, where guilt isn't binary, where justice is imperfect. Most importantly, it represents the high-stakes human cost of investigative mistakes, of bureaucratic inertia, of looking the other way. Teachers who saw Rowan arrive at school without socks in winter will carry that image forever. Sheriff Jennings, who carried her photograph for 17 years, will never forget her face. The community of Stella will always know themselves as the place where a 9-year-old girl was murdered while the systems designed to protect her documented her suffering but couldn't save her life. And perhaps that's the legacy we must embrace if Rowan's death is to mean anything at all. Not the details of the crime, horrific as they are. Not the forensic contradictions or the legal proceedings or the 17-year journey to execution, but the simple, terrible truth that children cannot protect themselves. Adults must protect them. Rowan Ford's story is not just about her murder. It's about the weeks, months, and years before anyone killed her. The time when she could have been saved but wasn't. It's about teachers who saw the signs and reported them, only to watch as the system responded with lice treatment and nothing more. It's about neighbors who might have suspected something was wrong but didn't want to interfere. It's about Child Protective Services workers carrying impossible caseloads, trying to triage crisis after crisis with inadequate resources and legal tools that prioritize family preservation over child safety. It's about a little girl who went to school hours before it opened because school was safer than home. If you take nothing else from Rowan's story, take this. Children cannot protect themselves. They cannot escape bad homes on their own. They cannot advocate for their own safety in a world designed and controlled by adults. If something feels wrong, if a child seems afraid, if you notice signs of neglect or harm, please don't wait. Don't assume someone else has already called. Don't convince yourself it's not your business. Don't tell yourself that what you're seeing probably isn't as bad as it seems. Report it. Insist on follow-up. Be the adult who refuses to look away. You might be wrong. The child might be fine. But if you're right, if your call saves a life, then the awkwardness of being wrong doesn't matter. The National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 1-800-422-4453. In your own country, Call your local emergency number or child protection line. Please don't assume someone else will step in. Be the person a child needs. Rowan Ford is gone. We cannot save her. But there are children suffering right now in your community, in homes that look fine from the outside, in families that seem functional enough. Those children are still here. They still have time. They are waiting for an adult to see them, to believe them, to act. Be that adult. Forever 9, forever loved, forever a reminder that children deserve better. If this case moved you, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. On this channel, your voice matters. Sometimes the smallest detail, the smallest memory, or even the smallest comment can bring new eyes to a case that deserves attention. And if you ever notice signs of neglect or harm in a child's life, please don't wait. Children cannot protect themselves. Adults must protect them. If something feels wrong, if something feels off, if a child seems afraid, silent, or forgotten, report it. You might be the only person who does. You might be the only person who sees it. And you might be the person who saves a life. The National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 1-800-42-24453. In your own country, call your local emergency number or child protection line. Please, don't assume someone else will step in. Be the person a child needs. If you appreciate careful, respectful, deep dive investigations into cases that deserve remembrance, please consider subscribing to Crimes Unsealed. It helps this channel grow, it helps more people discover these stories, and it ensures that the victims we discuss are never forgotten. Thank you for watching, for caring, and for keeping these children's memories alive. These aren't just cold cases. These were lives, lives that mattered, lives that still deserve justice. Until next time, I'm your host, and this is Crimes Unsealed.